Emily, you heard the setup here that I was meeting with some pre-service teachers, and the question that was posed to me is this. They are meeting with, within the class grade, they're all planning together, and they're teaching a unit on literature. And what the other general ed teachers would do would be to read the story. They would do some questions on it, some worksheets. They would talk about it. They would do like a pre-test. And then the next day they would give the regular test. And her students were basically memorizing the answers, and they were doing well, but they weren't retaining it. And when she got ready to do her student teaching, she wanted to try to get them to do some higher level thinking. And so I was asking you about this, and you said you just covered a unit very similar to this in your own third grade class.
Yes.
So would you take a few minutes and tell us what your background, your student profiles, and how you covered this unit in your class? So Emily Morgan, go ahead.
Thank you, Ernie. So first of all, to give you some background, my first year teaching in Savannah-Chatham County Public Schools. My background is actually as an early childhood special education teacher. And this year, I'm the general education teacher in an inclusive third grade classroom.
So you have a co-teacher with you.
Yes,
Okay.
I have either a co-teacher with me or a paraprofessional with me. So there's always two adults in the classroom. And it sounds like the situation that the pre-service teacher talked to you about is very similar to how we do our planning on our grade level. So each teacher, we all collaborate together and come up with our lesson plans as a grade level. And then I take the lesson plan and I make modifications accordingly for the needs of my students.
Okay, would this be called differentiation?
Yes, so I differentiate my instruction, and I'll also differentiate the artifact that I expect at the end of the unit.
Okay.
So they all have to know the same according to the standards. So this week we're working on reading informational text and using the key details of a text and how they support the main idea. So this unit is on Frederick Douglass. And our last unit was Paul Revere. This unit is Frederick Douglass. And so a lot of times in the classroom, what people don't always consider is the spontaneity and the amount of flexibility you have to have. So we come up with these wonderful lesson plans, and sometimes things happen. So an incident happened in my classroom where unexpectedly it ended up just being myself in the classroom. And then a para joined me later, but we weren't able to break into our small groups to do the small group instruction that I normally do. So I thought, well, they still have to know the information. So I had them gather around as a whole group, and I began reading an informational text, the American Heroes version of Frederick Douglass. So I said, all right, guys, we're going to play a game. So we're going to do tally marks. This side is for the teacher, this side is for students. And you earn points for answering questions correctly, for answering on signal, because we have a auditory signal that I use when it's okay for students to answer all together. I use a pointer if I want someone to answer individually. So you gain points for answering on signal, for being respectful of your classmates, so having good sportsmanship, for answering correctly, and also I get points anytime I look up and see that you're thinking about something other than what I'm doing. So we sort of incorporated behavior into the game. So I started reading, and I would stop at the end of a paragraph and I'd go, And so I started with the basic questions, the who, when, where, and what, the general comprehension questions.
So who was Frederick Douglass?
Who was Frederick Douglass? When was Frederick Douglass born? Where was he born? What did he, so the first chapter talked about his passion for wanting to learn to read. So we talked about the basic who, what, when, and where questions. And then I would stop and I'd say, so why? We know that reading was illegal for enslaved people to learn to read. Why? What were the slave owners afraid of? And at first, because in my classroom, over half of my students are on IEPs, and many of the others are identified as early intervention. So I said, why? What were they afraid of? If they learned to read, they would find out about what? So I kind of lead them in that, and I try to be kind of dramatic in my asking to engage them. And at this point, everyone's leaning forward, so I know I have them.
So it's almost like a game?
Oh, it is a game. We get points. So they get points for the questions. So, and one student said, because then he would know how to escape. And I said, he would learn how to be what? And they said, free. They would learn about freedom, which was one of our vocabulary words this week. And I said, that's right. He could learn about freedom. And so then we went through and I kept asking the questions, and we're talking about how different different features of text. So captions and pictures. So what is this? This is and they'd say picture. What's a synonym for picture? Illustration. So you're going through and you're doing the one standard, but you're incorporating other language standards and other skill sets. So
you're really getting them to do higher level thinking.
Yes, and connecting it to their lives. So then I said...
So that's the hook.
Yeah, the hook, the activator is connecting it to their lives. What effect does he have on you? So what if Frederick Douglass was never existed? What would happen? And one of my students said, and I quote, you would be teaching a whole lot of white kids. And I thought, yes, I would. That is highly likely that I would be teaching all white children. All of my students would be white.
And what is the makeup of your class?
Oh, I have only one student who is Caucasian.
Okay.
The rest are African Americans.
So they really got it.
They really got it. And it was a huge impact. And then when I saw some of the kids kind of slouching down and, I could tell they were a little bored. And I thought, And I said, this was a man who could have died for his right to learn. How passionate was he to learn? And they recalled key details from the text. They recalled from the text that he would give the white boys in his neighborhood, the poor white boys, bread so that they would tell him what they learned in school. That's how much he wanted to learn. And then also, because I have a lot of students identified as non-readers, I said, how old was Frederick Douglass when he learned to read? And they all replied 12. I said, man, he was so passionate. He persevered. He persevered until he was 12 years old. So one of the little boys said, I'm 9, I can still learn. I said, absolutely, you can still learn.
So he was a non-reader.
He was a non-reader. He was like, I can still learn. I said,
that
absolutely.
Gave him hope.
Yes, and after the class, another little boy said, you think I can read like Frederick Douglass? I said, I know you can read like Frederick Douglass. So that was a connection to real life, and it was wonderful. And then you just hook them, you keep going. And, you give them little breaks here and there because, 50 minutes of Frederick Douglass is a lot. So we give brain breaks and that sort of thing, but the level of engagement was amazing.
You had mentioned to me earlier that you had them sit up.
Oh, yeah. So they were slouched down. I said, how do you think Frederick Douglass sat in those abolitionist meetings and in those meetings about freeing slaves? How would he sit? Would he sit like this, or would he sit like a leader? I said, sit like a leader. Sit like Frederick Douglass. And they did. And another little boy, about 10 minutes later, he goes, you're not sitting like Frederick Douglass, to another friend. So there was that. I could tell he got it. And so the end product is going to have to be a written piece. It's going to have to be some sort of illustration that they know. And I'm going to let them either do a picture or a thinking map. And then for my students who can, I'm going to have them do sentences and do a paragraph of informational, because that's the writing standard for this week.
So basically you got them to do higher level thinking. Mm-hmm. It was like a game. Mm-hmm. You were able to hook them into it and be able to relate it back to their own life.
Absolutely.
How would you rate the success of that particular on-the-fly lesson plan that you had to kind of pull out of the air because your regular lesson plan you weren't able to do that?
It wasn't feasible. On a rubric from 0 to 5, with 5 being engaging, effective, and that they had the key takeaways, it would be a 5.
Right. Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, we've also had a lot of questions from students asking about classroom management. And a lot of them just, what's the answer? Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about classroom management, is there one answer?
Oh, no.
And what does that depend upon?
It depends upon so many factors and variables. It depends on your students. It depends on, there are some basics that you need to follow. Positive reinforcement, differentiating your reinforcement, reinforcing those that are doing a good job. I think sometimes I, as an educator, take for granted the power of peer-to-peer reaction and relationships. So when I compliment a student for sitting properly or for using the just right voice, I don't have to focus on the student who's not, but I can look over and that student is sitting taller and that student is talking in the just right voice, because that interaction between peers is so important. Also, self-monitoring, the goal is by the end of the year for them to monitor their own behavior and for them to know the right thing to do. And I'll give reminders throughout the day. I also use a lot of visual reminders instead of the verbal.
I'll give you an example of that.
Sure. So I have one student who the target behavior for him is calling out. So instead of raising a quiet hand or holding a thumb to his chest, he'll blurt out the answer. So for me, what I do with him, because I do not want them to feel less than. I don't want them to feel like they're being picked on or only told when something's bad, because some of these kids get told that all the time and have been told that for years. So for this student, I'll look at him and I'll go like that. I don't do that because everyone knows what that means. But I look at him and I do a little bit like this at the corner of my mouth.
And is that your signal you worked out with him?
Yes. We had a one-on-one conference, just the two of us. It took 1 minute in the hallway. I said, all right, what can we do? He loves baseball. I'm like, how do catchers and pitchers communicate? And he was like, you could do this. And I said, so in the middle of a lesson, if I just all of a sudden go, wait, that might be a little obvious. What could we do? I said, what about this? He goes, okay. And so we worked it out. And now I don't even have to do that with that student anymore. It's gotten to the point where I can just look at him and he gets it. So it's all about, and sometimes it's really tempting to put something in place and then stop it when it shows no signs of improvement. But you really have to give a system a chance to become a system.
You know that with my big thing is teaching is building relationships. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like from what you're saying, you have really had to build relationships with each of your students.
Absolutely.
There's a saying, you got to know them to teach them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that would apply in the case with this particular student and your other students?
All of my students. So I know little things about all of them. I know one of my students loves princesses, and sometimes she has a hard time because of the different interactions she's had in the past with the same group of students. She's had a hard time being socially appropriate and kind of getting out of her, because some of these kids have gone to school with each other since kindergarten. So the behaviors that they displayed in kindergarten or first grade are constantly brought up to them from their peers. So at the beginning of the year, the very first day, one little boy tried to tell me something about this young lady in my class, something that she had done last year. And I said, ooh. I said, everybody in the classroom, raise your hand if you've made a mistake. And I raised both of my hands. I said, I don't want to know about your mistakes from last year. I don't want to know you back then. I want to know who you are today and who you want to be tomorrow. So I'm not going to tell you what I did. And from that point on, I learned about them.
So they get a clean slate.
They get a clean slate. And every day I say, it's a new day. And every afternoon, it's a new afternoon. I have several different behavior management systems in my classroom. And I even have some that are just for certain students. So I have the red light, green light, yellow light behavior system. I have the positive reinforcement money system where they earn money for certain things. It can be random money. I give out a lot of random gifts, like an eraser here, things that cost 1 or 2 cents, or extra 5 minutes of computer time. I have a goal sheet for the
Emily. So you basically talked about you have several different types of disciplines, ways to discipline students, and it's always very positive from what you're saying. Now, tell me about your goal sheets. Explain what that is.
Sure. So I was noticing, first what I did was I broke the day down into 3 parts for my other behavior management system, the green light, red light, yellow light. So they always know they can move back to green, and it's based on morning, lunch, and afternoon. And then I was noticing that they needed something extra. And so we came up with a goal sheet, and it has the student name, what week it is, and then a line for the goal. And the student, the first week, I came up with the goal for the student. So I said, I think this is what you need to work on. So an example of one of the goals is I will show the teacher I'm listening with my whole body. And then I would say, so what does that look like? What does listening with your whole body mean? It means that you're sitting up, means that your body is still for the most part, and that your eyes are on the teacher or whoever is speaking. So that's listening with your whole body. So that's some of their goals. One of their goals is I will use a level 0 or 1 voice during instruction. So we model that. What does that look like? One of the goals is I will use friendly words with my classmates or with my friends. So what are some friendly words? What is friendly body language? Or I'll have the just right reaction. So I put that just right in quotation marks on their sheet. So if I'm not able to call on you during a group discussion, because a lot of my children get really upset if I can't call on them every time. And so the just right reaction is, instead of man, or ooh, the just right reaction is, okay, maybe next time. And that's the just right reaction. So there's different goals for different students, and it changes by the week, whatever they feel like. And then they get to choose a reward. So during the last 10 minutes of school, during pack up and bus being called, they can choose a reward. It can be Play-Doh, it can be computer time, it can be visiting Coach Crawford and taking their book bag with them and leaving from there. It can be visiting a different classroom and showing them their goal sheet, showing another teacher their goal sheet, something along those lines, nothing that costs money. And so that's their reward. And to earn it, and this is how I differentiate it. So not only are the goals different for each student, but the amount of points they need to earn their reward is different. So there's 18, I break it down by class. So there's a chance for 18 points, 2 points per class period. So they get a point if they follow the 3 rules: be safe, be respectful, be responsible. They get a point for that if they do that during the class. If they meet their goal, they get another point. So if they do those things, they get 2 points. So there's 9 blocks, so it's a possibility of 18 points. Some of my students, to be successful and to earn their reward, have to have 16 out of 18 points. Some of mine can be as low as 14 out of 18 based on the severity of the behavior we're trying to address. So we want them to feel successful. So is it an 80% rate all the time? No, but we build up to that. And what's really cool is that now the students are beginning to mark their own sheets, and they're being honest about it. Some of my students, I still have to mark for them, but we talk about it. I'll say, did you meet your goal? How can you tell me that you met, show me evidence, cite the evidence. And so we have those conversations. It takes 1 minute at the end of each class to do that, literally 1 minute. So before they get ready to leave the classroom, we do it at the end of every class. We also do it for lunchtime and specials. Because some of them behave one way for me, and then when they go to more unstructured times, their behaviors fluctuate.
What's an example of an unstructured time?
Sure, so times of transition. So moving from one class to the other, it's very tempting during those times for students who have impulse control issues or ADHD or children with autism. It's a very loud time. It can be very unstructured. Gym is another unstructured time. Art, music, those are much less structured than my time in my classroom. So I try to put systems in place to prevent the undesired behavior. So within the first week of school, it became clear to me that transitions were an issue for my students. So because I always have another adult in my class for the most part, anytime we leave the classroom, we have 2 separate lines, and we leave a minute apart from one another. Because it's much easier for 8 or 9 students to get along and follow directions and be around other people in the hallways than it is for a group of 18 or 19.
Okay, one last question.
Sure.
And I really appreciate you talking with me. What advice would you give to a pre-service teacher who is about to graduate and to go into the classroom for the first time? What would you say to that particular pre-service teacher?
I would say be open to learning every day. Learning about your students, learning what they need, and be open to making mistakes and be like, oh, that was a great plan. It didn't work. What can we do now? Instead of doing an autopsy on what didn't work, move forward, and you constantly just be open to learn. Learn from other teachers, learn from paras, learn from parents, learn from students. Be open and be vulnerable. Be vulnerable enough to say, man, that was a wonderful plan. It did not work. The story I always tell is I had a group of students with autism, and we were doing Earth Day, and I had this great project plan. I mean, great, and I'm not the craftiest of people. We were going to make paper mache Earths. And this is in a kindergarten or first grade class. So we were going to use a balloon and use paper mache. We were going to paint it. Within 10 minutes of this project, it was a hot mess. It did not work. And I just scrapped it and did something new. And you just have to be flexible, and you have to deal with ambiguity. And so my advice would be flexible and be open to learning.
There's a saying that says teachers make a difference every day. What do you think about that?
I think it is very true, but I don't know that I always am able in the moment to see the difference. Sometimes I think teachers, because we're givers and because we're caregivers, we are, trying to take care of everyone, and we're trying so hard to give. Sometimes we don't give enough to ourselves. We don't give ourselves enough credit. We don't give ourselves enough time, me time, alone time, reflection time. And I think sometimes it is hard for us to see the difference we make. But when you see it, you see it. You feel it. You see it. I see it in some of my students' eyes. I see it in the eyes of some of the parents. Some of these parents looked at me the first time, and I felt such wariness from some. They were so skeptical. They were so like, oh, here comes another teacher. What are they going to say about my child? And then to build that relationship with them and to see the difference when I tell them their child is smart and when I call them to tell them something good, not something bad. I see the difference there. I see the difference in my students. I had a young lady who, she really has a hard time. She has an explosive temper. I mean, she just bubbles up and bam, she's there. And the other day she came up to me, she said, I didn't get mad at him. I walked away. I clenched my fist. I walked away. Can you believe it? And I said, absolutely, I can believe it. And she gave me a huge hug, and I thought, that's a difference. She walked away. Instead of hitting the wall or instead of yelling at this young man, she walked away.
Okay.
That's a difference.
Emily, give us your background. Tell us your degrees, where you've been educated, where all you've taught.
Sure. So my undergraduate degree is actually a liberal arts general studies degree from Armstrong.
Armstrong
Atlantic State University in Savannah.
Okay.
I went to Georgia Southern for 3 years, and then I finished up at Armstrong. Then I did a general studies degree with an emphasis in psychology. And originally, as the grand plan goes, I was going to take a year off, work at Starbucks, and then go back and get my master's in social work or something along those lines. I wasn't sure. But I thought I'll take a year off and work at Starbucks. So I started working at Starbucks, and I ended up continuing to move up, and I was a store manager for them. I did trainings for them. I was, the next step would have been district manager, making great money and loving what I did. But my favorite part was the teaching aspect. I facilitated workshops, and every year I volunteered with kids at Camp Aloha for Hospice Savannah. So I've always loved children, and I've always loved children who are different and who don't fit the mold that we think of with children. I'm a product of the Savannah-Chatham County Public School System. I graduated from Jenkins. I lived in Atlanta for the last 12 years. And I went back when I was 30. I went back and got my master's in early childhood special education from Georgia State University. And I had the privilege to work with Dr. Gallagher and be her graduate research assistant. And I did a student teaching at Coralwood School in DeKalb County. And it was like a living illustration to the textbooks that we were reading in grad school. Oftentimes you read of how it should be in schools, and then you go out and it doesn't match. And Coralwood was like a living illustration. And I was in an inclusion kindergarten classroom there. And I had the opportunity while I was still in grad school to be a facilitator for students with autism at the Amit School, which was a private special education school, Jewish education school in the Atlanta area. And I ended up teaching full-time for them, and it closed. Unfortunately, it had to close its doors after me being there for 2 years. And then I went and worked at a startup school, a startup private school, and worked with children with disabilities there, mostly autism. Then I had an awesome opportunity to move to Turkey and teach English as a second language to Turkish kindergarten students. So I lived in Ankara, Turkey, for a year or 11 months, and had an amazing experience there and learned so much while I was in Turkey. And I've always loved Savannah. I haven't lived here since about 2000 or 2001. and my dad still lives in Savannah, and I really have wanted to come home for quite some time, and I've wanted to contribute. I've always felt pulled towards Title I schools, but circumstances have always placed me in different opportunities for learning, and I've always felt pulled to Title I schools. And this year, so we're in, I think, week 11 or 12, and as challenging and sometimes difficult as my days have been, I feel more fulfilled where I am today than I ever have. This is when I imagined going back to school and getting my master's degree, this is what I imagined. I imagined an inclusion classroom. I imagined students with issues with behavior, issues with learning. This is what I imagined, and this is where I have felt compelled to be. So, I mean, in terms of pre-service teachers, you have an idea. I had an idea in my head of what teaching would be like. And some of it is exactly what I thought, but every day I learn something new. And that's what I love about teaching.
And where are you now?
Oh, I'm at Thunderbolt Elementary in Savannah, Georgia, and I am in a third grade inclusion classroom.
Okay. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Ernie.